Okay, excellent. Welcome back to the fourth installment of the Whatever Happened series, where we're taking a look at things which are not quite the same as they used to be. So as many have noted, that we're doing a different topic than was originally planned. We were originally going to look at where the location possibly is today of the Arna Kodesh, right? Because we know what Harrison Ford had an attempt to find it. But where does our tradition say it is right now? So we'll do a vote for next week, which will be the last series. Should we do that, or should we do Tchelas, which is the blue string that people have on their? What do you say? All for the mystery of the lost ark. Yeah. Hands. I need hands. Hands.
Yes.
One. Okay. And Tchelas.
Next, the following, 2 weeks later.
So if we extend the series, or we'll do a mini series. Okay. So that's what we'll do. So next week we'll do Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then Tchelas will either figure out a different medium. 2 weeks. Shvuayim. Yeah, every 2 weeks. Yeah. Next session, I mean. Yeah. Okay, so that's what we'll do. Bezrat Hashem, you'll see that. But the reason why I specifically wanted to do this one now is for those that were here last session 2 weeks ago. You would have been privy to an excellent class shir that Rabbi Edery gave about the. Thank you very much. About the Sanhedrin, or the Bezdin Hagadol, that we don't have it now. We used to have it back then, and what Jewish life, what the changes were since we don't have the central Bezdin. Like, what value did it have? And a lot of ensuing questions came up just about Semicha, because he kept on talking about that in order to have the Sanhedrin, you need to have Semicha, and we don't have the Semicha now. And a lot of people had, especially at the end, when we had kind of a question-answer session at the end of his year, a lot of people had Semicha, and it was just not his topic of, not the topic that he was talking about. So it would have just diverged the topic. So in my head, I said, "Wait, that fits perfectly into this section, into this general theme, and it's an absolutely fascinating topic, as you'll see." So I thought, let's touch on it now. So it's a nice dovetail extension of last session's discussion, and I think that you're going to be privy to a really, really fascinating look at what the concept is, and some fascinating little tidbits of historical pockets in Jewish history that you may have not been aware of. So like this, first of all, Semicha. Semicha, what does it mean? The word? Yeah, that's kind of how we use it now, ordination. Definitely doesn't translate as ordination, huh? Yeah, like to lean your hands to be, like if I want to be some, like in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, you would say, if you would be like samach to something, be close to something or placed next to something is what right?
It's actually to lean for support.
To lean for support. Exactly. Oh, very good. Somech noflim, Hashem, God, we say in the second bracha of the Shemana Esrei, Mechal Kachayim, one of the things we say is Somech noflim, that he supports the fallen. And we see that the very first time we see one great rabbi or rabbinic figure passing on the yoke, the burden, responsibility to lead the Jewish people to the next great leader, that was Moshe, to Yehoshua. And twice in the Torah, once in Sefer Bamidbar, once in right all the way at the end, the very third or fourth last pasuk in the Torah, we have this word of samach. And there's this in Sefer Bamidbar. I just have a few psukim over here to give us a little bit of context. But at the end of the day, the very last pasuk says, "Vayismach es yadav alav vayitzavehu kasher dibar Hashem biyad Moshe." That Moshe was vayismach es yadav. He leaned his hands on support over Yehoshua's head, and that was like the physical act which signified the formal shift from Moshe to Yehoshua. And now the Jewish people had the leader that they needed in order to cross the Jordan River and get into Israel with proper leadership. So that's what the word means. Nowadays, this rabbi has Semicha. Where do you have Semicha from? This rabbi has Semicha. Where does he have Semicha from? So we still use that same terminology, but what I want to try to understand together is that, spoiler alert, it's very different what it is now than what it was. I want to look at why that stopped, when it stopped, and what the differences are between the modern day Semicha, which we translate to be ordination, and what we'll call original Semicha was. Okay, so what we call Semicha, we say ordination, which basically means I have Semicha, for example. No great rabbi has ever put their hands on my head. That wasn't part of the process. It's more of a testing process. I'll tell you, actually, I have Semicha from a few places. One of I've to be just a little bit more specific. So I have one institutionalized smicha, which means like the yeshiva or the kollel that I went to while I was learning my halachic topics in Israel was something called the Center for Kehillah Development, and it was a 5-year program where we learned. It was a very intense day. It was about 11 and a half hours a day of scheduled learning time or testing time or review time in each day's schedule. Monday, I would say through Friday, but they actually let us off a little bit early before Shabbos. Okay, thank God. You have to do that in a smicha program for sure. But it's a very intensive program, and not only did the institution give us smicha, but we also went all together to take the Rabbanut smicha. And the Rabbanut smicha is the smicha that the state of Israel still today gives out, and it's just a great point just to talk about for a moment, because a lot of people are unaware of what the Rabbanut Smicha is, and it's absolutely magnificent. It's one of the most remarkable experiences of my life, the first Rabbanut Smicha that I took. You go, back when I think they changed it a little bit, but when I was doing the first test that I took, you go to Binyanei HaUmah, do you know where that is? Center of Yerushalayim, Binyanei HaUmah, and they rent out like the big hall in Binyanei HaUmah, and you walk in, and there's proctors, you go in completely empty-handed. You go in with the pens of your choice, pens, can't write in pencil, and it's a 5.5 hour written test. There's no technology. In fact, you hand in your phones before the test, or in Israel style, since most people don't have smartphones over there, at least in the chevra that I was with taking the test. So they just make you take out your phone, take the battery out, and put it in 2 separate pockets in whatever bag you came with. And there's proctors walking up and down the whole time. 5.5 hours written test, and the biggest challenge is that it's not enough time to finish. That's literally the biggest challenge. They're like mini essays that you're asked to write. When you finish it, everything needs to do well and pass. Everything needs to be sourced, but you're not allowed to have any books there. So everything has to be essentially memorized. They ask you kind of open-ended questions, and you have to kind of write a mini essay, a few pages at least, explaining what your thinking is to answer that question. If you just happen to write the right answer, you'll literally fail the test. If you write a beautiful background explanation of your thinking and you happen to get the answer wrong, you'll actually not only pass, but probably do pretty well. What they really care about is the log of background information that you're able to collect and write in a systematic and clear way. Those papers get photocopied, you're just a number, it gets marked by 2 individual rabbis, and they don't know who you are, you don't know who they are, but they're paid by the Rabbanut to mark these tests, and those 2 marks get averaged. If you get above a 65, you pass. If you get below 65, you fail. About 60% of people who take any given Rabbanut test fail. So the majority of people who take a test will fail the test. So it's rigorous. It's rigorous. The testing in the Rabbanut is fantastic. But what the amazing experience is, you walk into the Binyanei HaUmah, and you're in this huge hall with hundreds of hopeful rabbis or already rabbis that are trying to take more tests than they have, because there's like 15 different tests, even more than the Rabbanut offers. You could always climb the hierarchy of the Rabbanut tests, and you're just sitting there, and it looks like you're taking the LSATs or the MCATs. I would imagine, although I haven't taken any of those. People are so serious about what they're doing. They're writing, and their heads are down, and and you look around. I remember I stopped because if you're an English speaking person, Anglo, you could write a letter to the Rabbanut beforehand and apply for 45 minutes extra, because it takes some time to understand the questions, right? Yeah. So we got the extra time. So I had some time to spare at the end. So I took some time in the middle, to look around, and it's just to appreciate what's going on. You have like every single color kippah in the same room. Like, it's just the whole Klal Yisrael in the same room, writing the test so seriously, but everyone is like just regurgitating at least a year, sometimes 2.5, 3 years of dedicated learning that they're just regurgitating at will, just like writing it down with fluency. It's absolutely a beautiful sight. I would say go see it, but it's impossible to get in if you're not actually writing a test. But it was a beautiful experience that I had. So it's that, and I also have personal smicha from some very close rebbeim of mine in Israel, for example, Rabbi Weiss, and a couple others. So while I was in Israel, once I did get a bunch of smichas, but none of them included anyone's rabbi's hands on my head. It was more of an intellectual test, or do you understand the material well enough that we, rabbis, will sign the name on a certificate, will trust you to now judge or give halachic decisions in the topics that you were tested on. And that's what it is nowadays, which is kind of ordination. It's more of a diploma now, but back then it was more, it was like a different formality, which we'll talk about. Yes?
Were any of the tests oral?
It's interesting. In the Rabbanut, no. In the personal smichas and the institutionalized smichas that I have, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, once, yeah.
So no rabbi ever places hands on your head, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Out you go. That's then. Okay, so now maybe we'll see why. Over here, right at the top, I just have a couple of things that Yora, Yadin Yadin, and Yatir Bechoros Yatir. And I put that in because someone randomly in the community, not knowing I was giving this class tonight, asked me yesterday as I was walking out of my office. I've been just, in other faiths that have like priests, you have so many different levels of what the spiritual leader is. You have, like, for example, in Catholicism, you have a deacon, and you have priests, and you have bishops and archbishops and cardinals, and then you have the Pope. By us, everyone's a rabbi. You can be a rabbi who studied for like 50 years, you're a rabbi. You can be a rabbi who did like a 2-year smicha, and you're a rabbi. So like, how come we don't have like the same hierarchy degradations as other things? So it's interesting because the real answer is that it used to be that we did. In any smicha, it could say yore, which means that you have been tested and they have faith that you could decide halachos of yoredea, which is like kosher, family purity. That's in the section of Shulchan Aruch called yoredea. And then you have yadin, which is the level up, which basically says that you are entrusted to decide monetary things. You're essentially a dayan, a judge. So there's a lot of people nowadays are dayanim. A lot of them still go by rabbi, don't go by dayan. If you're the av bezdin, you're the head of a bezdin, so then oftentimes their title will be just socially changed to dayan instead of rabbi, but it's not so common. And in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, there was even a third level, which was considered more exclusive and harder to get to, which is yatir bechoros yatir, which means that you could decide questions that came up with a carbon that came. Is it a kosher carbon? Is this little cut on the lip considered a mum, a blemish that we can no longer bring this animal to the mizbeach, yes or no? So that was like the highest level of smicha. Fine. So now, what I want to share with you is an amazing story, which is going to be referenced a couple of times much later in history after this happened. But we believe that there was this thing called the original smicha, which we saw in the Psukim, started with Moshe, and he gave it to Yoshua. And we believe that chain went unbroken for many, many years, until the 4th or 5th century, as we'll see. But there was a time over here, in the times of the Tanaim, that it almost got broken, but because of this remarkable and legendary heroism of this man, this Tana by the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, so he saved the smicha to allow it to continue to go on. Again, the smicha that we have now is not the same as the original smicha. It went in an unbroken chain from generation to generation, where rabbis who had smicha would be able to put their hands on top of someone who didn't yet have smicha and give them smicha. And that also empowers them, if they meet a rabbi later on in life that they think is deserving of smicha, if you got smicha, you can give smicha. And that chain went unbroken, and anyone who had smicha was able to say, I could show you on the list that the person who gave me smicha got smicha from someone who got smicha from someone who got smicha from someone who got smicha from Moshe Rabbeinu. You would be able to trace that lineage directly back to Moshe. We can't do that anymore. The smicha that we have now is not that original chain of unbroken chain of smicha that started with Moshe. Now let's take a look at this absolutely fascinating Gemara that we have in Masechah Sanhedrin, Daf Yudalad Amud Aleph, which tells us like this. The Gemara happens to be kind of in middle of a little bit of a technical discussion that it had just said that in order to give smicha, you need to have 3 people present. One of the 3 people need to actually have smicha, and the other 2 need to be present in order to formalize a bezdin, right? A Jewish court. And then you could pass on the smicha. But then the Gemara says, wait, one second, I don't get that. The Gemara interjects. and says, starting at the top, V'chad lo samich, is it really true that one man alone, who obviously has smicha, can't pass on the smicha? V'ha, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Baram Zachar Oso Ish Latov, there's this man who's remembered for greatness, for goodness. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava Shemo, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is his name. Why is Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava remembered Zachor Latov? Who else is Zachor Latov? Huh? Eliyahu Navi and? Isn't Mordechai also Zachor Latov? Charvona Zachor Latov. Thank you very much. Yeah, I remember so. Okay, good. Charvona Zachor Latov. So Charvona, we have Eliyahu, and we have Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. 3 people who are Zachor Latov. And everyone needed to do something. Charvona was the go-between between Mordechai and Esther, giving the messages back and forth. So Charvona had a role in bringing the story. Zachor Latov, right? And Eliyahu, we know he's going to be the person who's going to give the final message of the redemption. Zachor Latov. What did Yehuda ben Bava do to join this very exclusive club of Zachor Latov? So the Gemara tells us, She'limalehu, if it wasn't for him, bitlo dinai knasos miYisrael, we would not be able the ability to implement fines and certain monetary decisions would cease to be in the Jewish people. That happens to be a more of a technical way of saying that smicha would have ceased, because in order to be done dinei knasios, in order to adjudicate monetary cases which have to do with a knas, which is like a fine, you need to have smicha. In other words, you need to have a Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava apparently saved the smicha from being broken. It ended up being broken later, a few generations later, as we'll see. But it would have stopped in the times of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, but it didn't because of his heroism. And the Gemara tells us the exact story. Shapam achaz gazra malchus harasha. There was a time that when the Romans were in charge, that they made a gzeira. What was the gzeira? What was the rule against the Jewish people? Al Yisrael. Shekol hasomech yeharag. If you were caught giving smicha, you were put to death. It was considered a capital crime to give smicha. Okay, that's what the non-Jews, that's what the Romans said. V'chol hanismach yarog. And if they found anyone who got smicha, they would get killed. Ve'ir shesomchin ba, any city that was found liable for hosting a smicha graduation, so to speak, techarev, that entire city will be destroyed, will be burnt to the crisp. V'tchumim shesomchin bahem ya'akor, in any region that was found giving smicha, that entire region will be destroyed. The tchum, so 2,000 amas around the city, that would be destroyed as well. Essentially, what they wanted, obviously, the plot or the ploy is the goal is very obvious. They didn't just want to kill the bodies of the Jewish people, right? This Malchus Harashah, they were more interested in killing not Jews but Judaism. Right? That's really what they. So if they could just break the chain of leadership of Torah teaching of smicha, so then they could assume that assimilation, give it another generation or two, if the smicha is not there, assimilation will come. That's what their theory was. So they made all these rules against the chain of smicha. So you could see why it was so difficult to keep up in such reality in the world. Yes?
The Romans, was that decree only against smicha, or just generally studying and lecturing in Torah?
Right, so we know from other Gemaras that specifically during the times of Hanukkah there was other Gzeris as well, but apparently there was a time that this was their main focus. They wanted to break the chain of smicha. That's what it was. Did it overlay with other times that they had other Gzeris too? Quite possibly. Can't say for sure. So Ma Asa Yehuda ben Bava. So what was Yehuda ben Bava's reaction? Yehuda ben Bava, by the way, did have smicha, but he didn't want to risk anyone else's lives to give smicha. If he finds one person, okay, Mayor, come here, and gives Rav Meir smicha in someone's basement, right? If they found out that happened in that city, then all the civilians in the entire city would have been put to death. So Yehuda ben Bava didn't want to harm or potentially harm anyone else's life. So what did he do? Ma'asa Yehuda ben Bava, halach v'yashav lo bein shnei harim gedolim, ubein shtei aros gedolim, bein shnei tchumim Shabbos, bein usha l'shafra'am. L'shfara'am. Okay? Beautiful. So where is it? B'tzafon. Very nice. Up north. Okay. So he went and he sat between two mountains, that were between two cities, that were between two tchumim. So even if he got caught, the only lives that will be in danger potentially would be his, and whoever gives smicha to. So whoever is willing to join him are willing to be the hero, but they're not risking anyone else's life. You're not, if you want to be a hero, be a hero. Don't force heroism on other people, right? So that's what he did. V'samach sham chamisha zekenim, and he gave smicha to 5 elders who had yet had smicha. Ve'eluhein, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, Rabbi Avira, and Rabbi Avira had maybe a 6th. Rabbi Nechemiah. Recognize any of these? Recognize this group of 5? Huh? Huh? I can't hear. I got it? No, some of them appear in the Kara. But these are the 5 students that Rabbi Akiva, after his 24,000 students died, these were the 5 that Rabbi Akiva had the tenacity to say, I will not give up. I'm going to rebuild a new yeshiva with the premise of V'ahavta Le'arecha Kamocha through these new 5 students. Right? So, but apparently he never gave them smicha, right? Didn't have smicha, but they were just 5 great rabbis, right? But Rabbi Yehuda and Baba took these 5 students that Rabbi Akiva invested everything in and gave them formal smicha somewhere in the middle of no man's land. What happened? Kivin Shekiru Oivehem. The government found out, and Amar Lahem. So he told these 5 students, Bini, Rutsu, go, run away. So Amar Lo, they said to their master, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, who just gave them smicha, Rabbi, Matei Lecha, what's going to be of you? Amar Lahem, just run away, don't worry about me. Hareini muta leflechem ke'even she'ein lo hovchim. I'm going to stand before them or before you people, I'm going to protect you, human shield, like a stone that cannot be flipped over. I'm not going to let anyone through. You just run, get as far as you could away from them. Hide. And Amr, when it was said about him that lo zazu misham, he didn't move from that spot, ad shenatsu bo shalosh meos lemvios shal barzel v'asu kikivra, that he didn't move from there until 300 iron spears pierced him and made him like a sieve. That was Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava's final day. So he literally gave up his life in order to perpetuate this chain of smicha. Right? So we know in the times of the Tanaim when this happened, Rav Meir had it, and all these five rabbis were, from what we know, pretty much the very last people to get smicha, because we don't have any record after that. We don't have a clear record when the formal smicha stopped. That's a very interesting point, very murky waters. But from most scholars and rabbis will tell you that it ended, if you look at this chart that I have on right at the top of page 3, it ended right when the stage of the Tanayim to Amoraim was shifting. Right? Tanayim, for those that don't know, is the title that we give the rabbis, or what we call the rabbis, the sages, who you could find in the Mishnah. Okay? If you see a rabbi in the Mishnah, they're called the Tana, which means the teachers. Okay? Now, once the Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi finished completing the actual redacting the Mishnayos, so then a handful of years later, the rabbis started writing the Gemara. And the rabbis that are found in the Gemara quoting the rabbis of the Mishnah, so we refer to them as the Amoraim. So you see the shift from Tanaim to Amoraim, even though it wasn't like an overnight thing, but we gotta have some lines that we could draw. So it was between the 2nd and 3rd century, right? That's when it happened. And Amoraim literally means like the sayers, or you're saying over, because really their job was to say over and explain what the Tanaim originally taught. So that's why they have those different. So right between there's probably very likely when the formal smicha came to a very sad ending. So now the question is, now that if we could put ourselves kind of in that point in history, fine, we lost the smicha, the Romans made it too hard, we just couldn't keep it up, and we lost that tradition. And once you lose a tradition in one generation, does that mean it's lost forever? We'll never have it again? Or could it be possible, and were there attempts in history, and the answer is yes, to try to reinstate the smicha, the original smicha? And anyone could say, well, I tested this young rabbi, he knows his stuff, I'll write him a document, a diploma and a certificate, and we can call it smicha if we want, but it's not going to be that original smicha. But are we able to reinstitute that original power of the smicha? And the difference is, could we create a Sanhedrin? Could we don dine knasios, do fines? And all the entirety of what the Sanhedrin used to do, we're obviously unable to do now, and the reason is because we don't have smicha. But if we would have some mechanism to reinstitute the smicha, then we should be able to get that all up and running. Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, I have to check it, but if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Ben
Yeah.
is one of the Aseret Rogel Malchut, one of the 10 martyrs that we read on Yom Kippurim.
Could be. We'll have to check that. Because I don't think so, but it could be. Fine. Because the three Hari Gamalkos did not actually happen at the same time. Like we read it, like the way the poem is, like they brought him. It actually happened.
One of them, but I wonder if this is this event that
Right.
is recorded here.
Right.
What's that?
So we'll have to check. I wonder if this is the event. So let's take a look at source number 3, the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos. Okay, we're going to see in source number 4 another Rambam, Maimonides, and the second one is going to be from Yad HaChazaka or Mishnah Torah. And what's important to keep in mind, especially for our discussion, is the Rambam was 17 or 18 when he wrote the Pirush Mishnayos, very young, and when he was much older, later on in his years, he published his halachic work, which is the Yad HaChazaka or the Mishnah Torah. That's going to be source number 4. And in both these sources, he's going to talk in a very similar vein about how to reinstate it. And he says like this. He says, I'm sorry, this is not translated, but we'll go through it together. V'yirali. So he starts off by saying, it seems to me. So he's already telling us that this is his own original idea. It's not a Gemara. It's not something he has a tradition on. He's saying, this is my own thought. V'yirali. It seems to me, Kishatia haskama mikol hachachamim v'talmidim, when there is a unanimous understanding, lahakim, to uphold or to create or to limnos, to choose, to appoint, aleim ish, meaning yeshiva, someone from the yeshiva, someone who's learned, v'yasimu oso l'rasha, to put him at the head, at the helm, ubavad sheyazeh be'eretz Yisrael, k'moshe zechar, needs to be in Israel, you can't do this outside of Israel, hine ha'ishahu tiskayim lo ha'yeshiva v'yasamach. Then as long as it's unanimously accepted by all the rabbis and all the chachamim, yes, you could reinstate the smicha. And then once he has smicha, then that person who the unanimous body of rabbis at the time gave smicha to, so then that person could then give smicha to the next person. You could reinstate it. And the Rambam, being the pragmatist that he always is, says, and I'll prove to you why it must be this way. She'im lo tomer king. If you say that there is no mechanism in place to reinstate the smicha, afshar shetimtza bezdin hagadol la'olam, then we'll never be able to have the Sanhedrin, the bezdin hagadol, ever again. Lefisha nitztarech sheyeh kol echad mehem samach al kopanim, because if you want to be a member of Sanhedrin, you need to have smicha. V'kadosh baruch hu Hashem ya'ad sheyashuvu. He already gave testimony. He already, through the prophets, through the Nevi'im, he already told us that the Sanhedrin would come back, K'moshe Namar, as it says in the very first parak of Yeshaya, Va'ashiva shoftecha kevarishona, that I will, God is saying through the Navi Yeshaya, I will return your shoftecha, meaning to say your judges, your halachic deciders, your smicha, your Sanhedrin, v'yotzecha kevatchila, ve'acharei chen yikari l'cha ira tzedek, and after that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. So it seems to be from the pasuk in Yeshaya that a prerequisite before we're able to see the true Messianic era really come to full bloom, we need to have the Sanhedrin in place. It says, it's not just like the order of the psukim, it says the Sanhedrin or Smicha will come back, and then the pasuk says so clearly, after that, we'll be able to call, the city of gold, the true city of righteousness. And just the order of psukim is like that. So the Rambam makes it so easy. But can you imagine, in the modern times, having all the rabbis agree to one rabbi being the new smicha person? I mean, that's like impossible, right? Because, you have to have rabbis on this side and rabbi on that side, both agree, but they don't even see each other as like legitimate rabbis. So we're very, unfortunately, this is a critique on ourselves. We're so polarized at this point that it's very, very hard. Like the Rambam says, yeah, if you get everyone to agree, it's great. But in actuality, if you think of who that could be and what that would look like, it's so impossible, like to actually imagine it on a realistic level. It's just so polarized these days. especially in Israel. And as the Rambam says, this needs to take place in Israel in order for it to be valid. So it's as we get closer and closer to better days, we need to see more peace coming, and that will be a sign that all the rabbis could get in the room together and say, you know what, that's going to be the person we're going to see as the grand rabbi, Rabban Shel Yisrael. They could give him smicha, and through that he could give other people smicha, and then the Sanhedrin could be reinstated. Okay, so now one major debate that's going to happen later on in history is that if you look at source number 4, the Rambam essentially says the same thing in different words. He's writing this much later in his life, but then he ends off with some 3 words which leave us with a little question mark. He says, "V'hadavar tzarech hechreya," that we still have to kind of deliberate on this. In other words, the Rambam later in his life didn't seem like he was so convinced about this mechanism that he seemed to be very confident about earlier on in his life when he wrote Pirush Mishmai. So that's an interesting thing, which later on, as we will see in this next section, is going to be part of the debate. So fast forward, the Rambam lived a few hundred years before this, but fast forward to the year 1538, where there was a significant push, and some might, I think it would be accurate to argue, somewhat successful reinstating this smicha. Right? There was this fascinating character by the name of Rav Yaakov Beirav, or known as the Ma'ari Beirav. If you go to Tzfat, you could daven in the shul, which he used to daven at, the Beirav Beit Knesset. It's there. I think it's the one that's all blue. You walk in and all the walls are blue. Right in, right in the area of Tzfat that I always find myself in somehow. I see Tzfat is very small, but I'm pretty sure I've just been exposed to downtown Tzfat, old Tzfat, exactly. But it's a beautiful neighborhood. The Beirav Shul is one which is still active. And he wanted to essentially take the groundwork, the Rambam, as the groundwork for his initiative, and say, hey, let's reinstate the smicha. In fact, I have over here, I found this on Google, that you have an image of the sign which is on his kever in Tzfat. Mari Beirav is buried in Tzfat. And it says, if you look at it, it's like a general sign for a few different Chachmei Tzfat. But the first one that it says is Mahari Beirav, so Rav Yaakov Beirav Mechadash, and it says in small, it's pretty small, I'm sorry, Hasmicha B'Tzfat, Hismich et Maran Rabbi Yosef Ka'aro. So he was the first person that got smicha. He reinstated smicha, and with his instated smicha, he gave smicha to Rav Yosef Cairo. Now that is hugely significant. Rav Yosef Cairo was the one who authored our Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law. I mean, there's very few people in modern Jewish history who are as significant as Rav Yosef Cairo, and he had smicha from the Mari Beirav, who was the one who initiated reinstating the smicha. Mechaber HaShulchan Aruch va'acherim, and he also gave smicha to other people. It says Nolad b'shnas Reish Lamed Hey, somewhere in, I thought it was Toledo, but somewhere in Spain, and Nifter Lel Shabbos Kodesh Rosh Chodesh Nisan Shnas Shin Vav. So I don't know where that city was where he's born, but my understanding he was born in somewhere in Spain. So that is Mari Beirav. So what happened in 1538 in this discussion? So basically, the Mari Beirav got together, I think it was 25 rabbis in Tzfat. And Tzfat then was the strongest Jewish community in Israel, was in Tzfat. And he got 25 rabbis to basically back him, saying, I'm the guy, I'm the man. He wasn't saying it in a haughty way, God forbid. He really felt that he was the person who everyone, he had the social connections and everyone liked him, and he was a huge Talmid Chacham, great wise man who knew it all. So if you, 25 rabbis, all agree that I should be the first person in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to get smicha, then you could give me smicha, then I could give you guys smicha. Let's do it. They all went, yeah, let's do it. And they did it. And then, only after that, and this was their fatal flaw, this was the error, they sent a letter to Yerushalayim. And they sent a letter to the Mahalbach. The Mahalbach was Rabbi Levi ben Chabib, known as the Mahalbach, and he was the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim at that time. And they sent him a letter, like, guess what? FYI, for your information, just thought we'd let you guys know in Yerushalayim, we reinstated Smicha and Tzfat. Yay, aren't you guys so happy? And then Rabbi says, what? What did you do? Like, you're supposed to send us a message before, ask us what we think. Even the Rambam that you're trying to utilize as your groundwork says very clearly it needs to be haskamas kol mikol hachachamim v'hatamidim in Israel. So what, Tzfat, you think that borders of Israel is around your tiny little hilltop city? That's the entire Israel, that you got 25 rabbis to represent the entire Jewish community in Israel? I mean, it wasn't nearly as many Jews back then in Israel as there is today, not even close. But the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim was slightly offended by the fact that he was notified after the fact and not before. Sometimes in life it's easier to apologize than to ask for permission. Sorry, but is it okay? And he said, no, it's not okay. And they actually went back and forth in quite seething letters. And I'll give you an example. The Mahabach's letters were published in something that he himself published called Kuntras HaSmicha, and Rav Yaakov Bar Lev, Mari Ben Beirav, in turn published his side of the letters, which are called Igeras HaSmicha. So now you have obviously more modern Sfarim that put them both together in one volume neatly for you, both Kuntras HaSmicha and Igeras HaSmicha, so you have the whole correspondence back and forth. But just to give you an idea of how seething these letters were back and forth together, I'm going to read to you this translation I just did today. I would call it more of a, just paraphrasing the parts that we'll read together. But I'll read the parts that are underlined, at least most of the parts that are underlined in orange. So he starts like this, and he says, Lav kachli kani ba'agma anan. We in Jerusalem were not weed cutters left in a pond. That's like rabbi trash talk, right? Like, what am I, chopped liver? That would be the modern expression. Like, what are we, chopped liver, that you tell us, oh, by the way, look what we did up here in Tzfat. And he says, it could just continue and right beyond that orange line, Milvad Kedusha Samakum. Aside from the fact that we're in Jerusalem and you're not. Okay, we're both in Israel, that's great. But there's no place like Yerushalayim. If it was only for the fact that we live in Yerushalayim, you should have the respect for us, from the mere fact that we're living here and you're not, that you should ask us before humbly for permission. What do you think about our structure, our mechanism? Do you think we're in the right? Do you think we're thinking about the right things, the right calculations, or do you disagree? Can we tweak our process? But you have to bring us in and make sure we agree. And then he says like this. He says you shouldn't have lenismoch gam anachnu es yadenu aleha bechasima shemotenu. You should have asked prior for the stamps with our names on it. You shouldn't have gone on rogue and do it without us. So now skipping down to the where the orange lines continue. Ve'achar bakashas amechilas mikvod torasam. I must ask for you to forgive, b'mechilas kvodo, like no offense, but you know what's coming. Something pretty offensive when someone says that to you. No offense, but so nira shadavar hazen natu midarach hamasar v'ayosha. You guys totally straight off the straight path over here. You were not acting appropriately. Shahay roy lehem shalola asus ma'isas lachtom v'haskamasam zos ad asher yadu ma befinu ancher hodatam aleinu rayoseihem aleha. You first should have showed us your work and asked us about your process, and only once we gave you the green light that we also agreed to what you guys are trying to accomplish, then gone ahead with your plan. V'ola haya al daiti limar aleim zchos al zev v'lomer shalios kavanasam l'shamayim l'maher l'hasik atachlis hachashuv haniskar. So maybe I tried, to be dam l'kav zchos, to give them the benefit of the doubt, and maybe they just wanted to rush and kind of how do you say, to go quickly when you send a letter quickly? You expedite the process, and by the time the messenger gets to Yerushalayim and then we deliberate and we ask them to fine-tune the process, it's going to take months. Red tape, once you get 2 rabbis in a room, 2 bezins in a room, forget about it. It's going to take months. So they just wanted to get to their goal. They didn't want to prolong the process. They just assumed that we would love what they're doing. That if they put this together as a favor to us, and they just assumed that we would be okay with them. But we're okay with it. Aval, he says, Edu Maspik, that's not enough to to paint their actions in a positive way. If that's what you guys had in mind, lo hetiva liros. Again, loosely translated, it's not a good look. Like, you didn't do it properly. You didn't go through the right protocol. Ve'adarabba, to the contrary. Mimakum shechashvu l'karev l'kayim ha'inyan dacho also. You wanted to ask us to put the final stempel of improvement on your work. Maybe we would have agreed to it originally if we could have been part of the process. But now that you're asking us after the fact, we're going to tear this document up. We disagree with this, and we're going to publicize everything that we disagree with the continuation of Semicha, and we don't like this guy, Mari Bey Rav, or the Semicha that he passed on to Rav Yosef Cairo. We just don't like it. They should have realized that we wouldn't have agreed without seeing their work beforehand. He continues, even maybe some hinting to even some personal attacks against Mari Barav. Mari Barav writes back to him, and it goes back and forth with several letters arguing whether or not if they did the right thing in Tzfat to reinstate this smicha. This is all 1583. Now it's 1538. Now, unfortunately, because of the back and forth of Jerusalem and Tzfat, this made local news. This was a big brouhaha, big discussion, and this made it, unfortunately, to politics. And at the time, the Turks were running what we would now call present-day, modern-day state of Israel. And they thought that this was a precursor for the Jewish people creating their own state of Israel back in the 1500s. If they want to reinstate their smicha, they probably want to make a Sanhedrin, which is an autonomous way to judge law. But one second, we're in charge of law and order over here, not them. So why do they want their own court system? Must be they're trying to set up their own grassroots movement to start a government. Now, there's no indication from our side of things that was the case, but the Turks thought that was the case, and there was a booty on Mari Bey Rav's head. There's a reward for it, so he had to run away. He had to leave the country. I think he went to Egypt, but he made it back to Israel at some point because he's buried there. So I don't know that story, how he got back to Israel, but I know he had to leave Israel, but not before giving smicha to Rav Yosef Cairo, and Rav Yosef Cairo gave smicha to the famous Al-Sheikh, and the Al-Sheikh gave it to Rav Chaim Vital, who was the famous disciple of the Arizal, who the Arizal himself didn't really write anything down. One little small kunches he wrote down. But we have enough svarim of the Arizal to fill up an entire bookshelf. Who did that? Rav Chaim Vital was essentially the stenographer of the Arizal, Rav Chaim Vital. So he was the last person that we know of that got this reinstated smicha. So kind of lasted for 4 generations and then petered out. But round of applause, great effort on Mari Bey Rav's. Maybe he slipped politically. He should have just sent that letter to Yerushalayim. Maybe that would have just torched it at the get-go, and the rabbis in Jerusalem wouldn't have let it get off the ground. Who knows? No one will ever know. But it didn't. If it would have been affirmed by the rabbis in Yerushalayim, it most likely would still be here today. But again, who knows? That's obviously historical conjecture, which is weak at the best of times. So we'll never know that. Alternative realities we're talking about. But we do know that there was a valiant attempt in 1538 to reinstate the smicha, and that was the first time that we know that this was even tried. Yes?
What happened to the bounty on his head?
He left. He escaped. He left the country. That's why he had to flee. And he literally gave up his social life because of this effort. I mean, he didn't know at the get-go that it would lead to that, but it was all because he sent to Yerushalayim, and it's a shame. If he just would have done it or sent beforehand, and everyone could have agreed, that whole bounty on his head would have not. It's because of the brouhaha that the argument between Jerusalem rabbis and Tzfat rabbis caused a little bit of a ruckus, and the journalists got a hold of it, and it got to politics, it got to the political level, and that was the end of Mari Bey Rav's career in Israel. Okay, so there's a couple failed attempts that happened after. Most notably, in 1948, Rav Yehuda Leib Maimon, who was the very first religious minister for the state of Israel. Very fascinating stories about him, but we'll have to leave those for now. But he wanted to reinstate Smicha and the Sanhedrin as a part of the 1948 establishment of the state. He thought that was a very important part of what it means to have a Jewish state, is to have a Sanhedrin. Now, the problem is just like we have now, we have the religious Zionists, and we have the Haredim. It existed back then, and there was no way that they'd be able to come to consensus, and that's part of the recipe. There needs to be a consensus of the rabbis in Israel, and that just was never going to be the case. Even the first chief rabbi, Rav Yitzchak Herzog, did not agree with the initiative because Rav Yehuda Leib Maimon would never be able to get the following away from reality, that the Sanhedrin, even in his proposal, was going to be a subordinate to the secular government. And Rav Herzog, from a religious perspective, he was a religious Zionist for sure, of course he was, but from a religious perspective, he held that to have a Sanhedrin which is subordinate to secular government means it's not a Sanhedrin. It's smoke and mirrors. He said if we're trying to reinstate it that way, it's just not worth it. We're just diluting the meaning of what Semicha and Sanhedrin means. Let's just wait for it's the right time that the government itself could be a halachic body. And we believe that time will come eventually. We believe this modern state of Israel is an extremely important historical and religious event in history, which will eventually evolve into what we believe is going to be the full Messianic era, which will be that the government and the Sanhedrin will be so intertwined, one won't be a subordinate of the other, it'll just be, everyone will be, Tichra, Koberach, Tichar, and Tishava Kolosh, and everyone will just want to do what Hashem wants on a religious level, and the secular values and ebbs and flows will all emanate from those Torah sources. Lastly, I want to bring up something extremely interesting, that as recently as 2006, look at this article in the Jewish press, published in 2006, by Dror Giller, who, I'm just going to read it inside, it's so fascinating. To avoid claims that they, in 2006, or late 2005, they were trying to, in efforts to reinstate the Sanhedrin once again, and to avoid claims that not all the rabbis of Israel were aware of the latest attempt to set up the Sanhedrin. So one thing the modern world has that they didn't have back then is way more forms of convenient communication, right? So they sent out 50,000 copies of detailed flyers were distributed to over 4,500 communities in Israel, obviously to the rabbis, to the leaders. 700 leading rabbis were contacted personally or by mail. Rabbi Moshe Halberstam, who just recently passed away, this is written in 2006, was chosen to be ordained after he received approval from Israel's leading rabbis, and when no objections were received from the hundreds of rabbis consulted via the mails. He was a senior dayan in the Eid Chared's court, the president of Hatzalah Israel, and the Rosh Kol of Galitzia Kol in Jerusalem. Leading rabbis including Rav Shalom Eliashiv, Rav Avad Yosef, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, just passed away a couple years ago, and many others gave their blessing, but did not join the Sanhedrin. The son of Rav Mordechai Eliyahu is one of the rabbis ordained. Rav Avram Shapiro abstained on the issue, but also refused to discourage it. So trying to walk that line. Rav Tzvi Eidan, the author of Asot Mishpat, which describes how it is possible to reestablish the Sanhedrin, a lot of my research and learning that went into preparing the Shir came from that sefer, was appointed as the interim president until an election is held. The elected Nasi, or the president of the Sanhedrin, is Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, and that is a title that he held until the day he passed away. Also, just a couple years ago, brilliant, a noted Talmudic scholar and a well-known Jewish philosopher, which does not do who he was, justice in that small description. Absolute genius. So technically today, we do have an established Sanhedrin. But since you didn't know about this until I just told you, it shows you that it wasn't with absolute unanimity. So it wasn't with a unanimous vote. So it kind of is a little bit of exactly what Rav Yitzchak Levi Herzog was afraid of. Is okay, we can establish the Sanhedrin, but if it's subordinate, if we don't have absolute, if Rav Liashon, Rav Yosef, and Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who were absolutely huge influence. I personally was at Rav Yosef's funeral. The news said there was over 1 million people there. 800,000, who could really count? I started running away because there's a point in time that I was moving forwards, but my feet weren't touching the ground. So I got really scared, and I started running home. It took me a while, but I had to squeeze through lots of different people and find a side alleyway in it was in Meir Sharim, and I ran home to Rechavi. I couldn't stay too long. But I mean, that's the amount of 800,000 million people are coming to someone's funeral. You can see how much weight that person holds. If that one person is not agreeing to being on the Sanhedrin, and Eliashiv had also like 400, 500,000 people at his funeral. Zolly and Nechemia Goldberg, these were huge influencers, huge names in the rabbinic world. So if they weren't part of it from within, they let it go. They didn't disagree. They said, "Yeah, you have our bracha," but not all in, or else they'd be part of it. So it shows that it wasn't done with absolute agreement from everyone. So it wasn't set up in the absolute. But who knows? Maybe this will blossom in to the full Sanhedrin when b'meher b'yameinu, when we have it. So just to finish off with a little tefillah and to focus in every time we daven Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, we say in part of Shemona Esrei, Hashiva Shavteinu Kavarishona, that we should have the judges like we had before. What's that referring to? That's referring to Sanhedrin and Smicha, V'yotzenu Kavat Chila, V'hasumeni Yoga, V'anacha, U'mloch Ata Hashem Levadcha, B'chesed, U'v'rachabim V'tzadkenu V'mishpat. We should, basically, we're praying to Hashem that all the pain and agony that comes about because we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the Smicha, we don't have the same judgment by way with the direction of the Torah that we used to have. Hashem, Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Hashem, you love Tzedakah Mishpat, you love righteousness, you love proper judgment. So help us bring back the Smicha. So we should see a day, b'meher b'yameinu, that we have the original Smicha to replace all the certificates that all the rabbis are getting nowadays. We should have real Smicha with two holy hands on top of rabbis' heads who are fitting to receive the Smicha. We should have the proper chain of Smicha reinstated in its full glory. Any questions? Excellent.
I have a
Yes.
funny comment. Our son Ezra, who's a rabbi,
Yes.